French, the British in particular, and the Chinese to continue fighting the enemies of the U.S. The German and Japanese leaders had thought the U.S. was simply too disorganized a place to respond to their strategic goals, and that the economy was gravely crippled. And therefore, in their strategic thinking, the U.S. would seek peace after 2 or 3 humiliating defeats. Instead, the U.S. society proved extraordinarily resilient and emerged from the conflict, as we know, the wealthiest and militarily most powerful country in human history, a position that this country has maintained despite or because of, I'll leave it to you to think through that question, 70 years of continuous war. We have been at war essentially since 1941 without stop. The result were 2 revolutions in global affairs, one coming at the end of World War II and the second at the end of the Cold War, as well as a revolution in domestic life, as the United States finally developed a strong national state comparable to its economic power. Now, since 1920, since the conclusion of the debates over the League of Nations, U.S. foreign policy had been guided by the principle of independent internationalism. Most American leaders agreed that the United States should be active on a global scale, but its freedom of action should not be limited in membership in multilateral organizations. The United States should have the ability to affect others when it had that power, but the United States should act to restrict the ability of other powers to affect the United States. American preferences should not be limited to having to take into account the needs, much less the desires or whims of other countries. So the United States refused to join in the League of Nations, but it sent an observer to participate in League discussions and debates. It took the primary lead in international disarmament negotiations during the 1920s, but refused to support the creation of any organizations that could monitor compliance. As part of those disarmament negotiations, the United States destroyed a number of battleships. So the U.S. was actually quite serious about downsizing its military to the degree that other powers would go along the same path. The United States participated in international economic discussions, but American policy was not to become a signatory to any treaty that allowed international supervision of American policies on credit, banking, or economic stimulus. Roosevelt, when he became president, did not challenge these assumptions. The challenges of the Depression were such that he really didn't want to spend much time worrying about international affairs outside of negotiating bilateral trade agreements which would re-stimulate international trade. He did not want to become involved in an alliance against either Germany or Japan. And initially, he assumed that American economic power could force the leaders in both countries to be more compliant with American demands. He believed in the power of sanctions to achieve U.S. strategic goals. However, by 1938, it's clear that Roosevelt came to the conclusion that a broader war was unavoidable in both Europe and Asia. The question for the United States, the question for his administration, was whether economic power alone could fend off aggression, whether the United States had sufficient military power to defend itself. And throughout the 20s and 30s, Congress had been cutting military budgets particularly in the mid-1930s, rather aggressively. And the question, the United States was going to have to decide whether it should intervene directly in European and Asian wars or create a barrier in the mid-Atlantic and somewhere in the Pacific that would create an American zone, presumably the Americas, all of the Western Hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islands, that it would not allow competing powers to enter. Probably arguably most Americans referred to themselves as isolationists. This meant simply that the United States should remain aloof from Europe's conflicts, from military alliances, or from commitments like the League of Nations that might limit the nation's ability to determine its own destiny. And the experience of World War I had been very embittering. It hadn't been worth the sacrifice. So there was no reason, most Americans thought, for the United States to become interdependent. The United States, even at the depth of the Depression, was wealthier than everybody else. And it had the size of the market, its own internal market was such that it could shut itself off from the world if it had to and sustain itself, particularly if in the process it essentially annexed Latin America, Canada, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. And Americans were deeply committed to demilitarization. From Harding to Roosevelt, one of the key goals of U.S. foreign policy was to induce other nations to reduce the sizes of their military forces. Roosevelt accepted this goal as well, and he withdrew American Marines from the Caribbean and Central American nations where they'd been stationed in the 1920s. And as war seemed to approach more closely, began in Asia and then began to approach in Europe, the response of Congress was to cut military spending even further and to have congressional hearings on the improper activities of munitions manufacturers and their efforts to drag the United States into war. So if Roosevelt thought that the United States was going to face a global war, he also understood that he had a population that had no interest in getting involved in a war whatsoever, much less a population that had no interest in becoming the policeman of the world, as we later became. The changes that happened, 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. A member of the League of Nations, both members of the League of Nations, and in 6 weeks conquered Ethiopia, one of the, I think, 2 or maybe 3 independent black nations in Africa. Despite the racism of U.S. society, the American public was decidedly strongly pro-Ethiopian and anti-Italian. I think it was the first indicator that people's attitudes can be very complex and contradictory. That because you think one way in one situation doesn't mean that you carry that thinking into another situation. Then in 1936, the Spanish Civil War began. When a fascist military effort was launched to overthrow the democratically elected Republican government. And in 1937, Japan, which had already occupied Manchuria, invaded China. These 2 tragedies were the real beginnings of World War II, Spain and China. And the U.S. was involved with both conflicts, though the popular mood was deeply anti-military. Congress cut so Roosevelt, responding to the demands of the apparent demands of the public, adopted a policy of neutrality and reiterated the importance of the open door policy, first developed as a U.S. policy for China, but as a model for international relations between developed and developing nations. Eventually, Roosevelt's policy would transform into one of armed neutrality and the provision of military supplies to China and England as they defended themselves. But the first response, the response from 36 through 39, was essentially, we will not provide arms to anybody who's a belligerent. So the side which had the best weapons, the Japanese and China, the Spanish fascists supported by Hitler, would have the edge because they could, the legitimate government of China and the legitimate government of Spain would not be able to acquire the weapons they needed to defend themselves, whereas their opponents had all the weapons, had unlimited access. But this was a popular policy, first put to the test actually in China rather than in Spain. Public opposition to getting involved with Spain or even to selling arms to the Spanish Republican government was very strong throughout the Spanish Civil War. In part, it's because the Catholic Church strongly supported the Franco Rebellion, the fascist rebellion. In China, though, the brutality of the Japanese campaign in China and the ability of Chinese forces to defend themselves led to a remarkable change in public opinion within the United States. At the beginning of the Japanese invasion, the American opinion was, it's none of our business, let's stay out of it. By 1938, the United States had 85% of the American public thought that China was a great nation and needed to be supported defending itself. So that made it easier for Roosevelt to begin shifting a policy of supporting the Chinese government. Though there remained opposition within Congress, despite the strong support across the nation, which again seems to be, given the depth and breadth of anti-Chinese racism within the United States, it's surprising that the United States public opinion would shift so quickly to a pro-Chinese position. So isolationist sentiment was particularly strong in the Midwest and the South. The large German and Irish ethnic communities remained overwhelmingly anti-British and vigilantly suspicious that the United States would be tricked once again into supporting Britain in a war that was none of the U.S.'s business, at least as German Americans and Irish Americans imagined what U.S. business was. And they worried, these two communities in particular, worried that a new war, the U.S. getting involved in a new war, would lead to renewed attacks on their civil rights as it happened in 1917.